Most people think Christmas is all about joy, gifts, and cozy nights by the fire. But behind the twinkling lights and cheerful carols lies something darker. A world of ancient curses, twisted folklore, and terrifying truths we were never meant to uncover. Tonight I've gathered 5 stories that will chill you to the bone. From cursed lodges to vengeful spirits, and even cosmic revelations, these tales remind us that some traditions are better left forgotten. I'm Bon, your guide through this descent into holiday horror. So lock your doors, stoke the fire, and whatever you do, don't follow the lights. I didn't want to go to the cabin. Let's get that out of the way first. Spending Christmas in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by snow and trees instead of Wi-Fi and malls, sounded like a nightmare. But Dad wouldn't stop talking about getting back to our roots. Apparently, the cabin had belonged to some distant great uncle who died without any kids, so now it was ours. It'll be good for us, Mira, Dad said on the drive up, all cheery and oblivious. Family time. Just the 4 of us. No distractions. He had no idea how ironic that would turn out to be. There was me, your average moody 17-year-old who would have rather been anywhere else. My little brother Ben, who spent the entire drive annoying me by trying to poke me with a candy cane. Mom, who looked as skeptical as I felt but didn't say much because she's been doing the supportive wife thing since forever. And of course, Dad, the optimist who thought a remote, crumbling cabin was going to bring us closer together. It was already dark when we got there, and the place looked like something straight out of a horror movie. 2 stories of creaking wood, icicles hanging off the roof like teeth, and windows that reflected the headlights in a way that made me shiver. Home sweet home, Dad announced, like he was trying to sell us on it. Night 1. The first night wasn't terrible, but it wasn't great either. The cabin was cold and smelled like old wood and something faintly metallic. Dad lit a fire, and we ate instant noodles while Mom unpacked the decorations she'd insisted on bringing. She even put up a tiny Christmas tree in the corner of the living room, all sad and lopsided. I went to bed early, partly to avoid everyone and partly because I couldn't stop feeling off. Like the cabin was too quiet. The kind of quiet that presses in on your ears. Sometime after midnight, I woke up to a sound. At first, I thought it was the wind, but no. It was singing. Faint and high-pitched, coming from outside. The melody was weird, like it was trying to be a Christmas carol but had all the wrong notes. I sat up, heart pounding. I told myself it was probably just the wind, but my feet moved anyway, carrying me to the window. The forest outside was pitch black, except for the snow glittering in the moonlight. I didn't see anything, but the singing didn't stop. If anything, it grew louder, closer, until it sounded like it was just at the edge of the clearing. Probably carolers. Dad said the next morning when I told him about it. Carolers. I stared at him. Out here? In the middle of nowhere. He shrugged. Maybe it's a local thing. It wasn't. Night 2. The second night, Ben woke us all up at 3 in the morning, screaming. There was a face. He yelled, tears streaming down his cheeks. It was at the window, looking at me. Dad groaned, rubbing his temples. He probably just had a nightmare. It wasn't a nightmare. Ben snapped, and I'd never seen him look so scared. It was real. It was a woman, and her eyes were white, like snow. Mom sat with him for the rest of the night, but none of us really slept. The next morning, we found the first snowman. It stood in the middle of the yard, perfectly built, with coal eyes, a carrot nose, and stick arms. Who made this? Dad asked, looking at each of us. No one answered. That's Kind of creepy, Mom admitted, giving it a wide berth as we loaded firewood into the cabin. We told ourselves it was just kids from a nearby town messing with us, but deep down I think we all knew better. Night 3. The snowman had moved closer. It was only a few feet closer to the cabin, but it was enough to make me feel like throwing up. It still looked the same, perfect and cheerful. But the coal eyes seemed darker somehow, like they were watching us. Dad tried to laugh it off. Must have been the wind. Are you serious? I shot back. Wind doesn't move snowmen. That night, the singing came back. Louder this time, and with words. 1 for the night, 2 for the fear, 3 for the cold that's drawing near. The voice was high and thin, and it sounded like it was right outside my bedroom window. I shoved my pillow over my head and prayed for it to stop. It didn't. Night 4. The snowman was at the front porch when we woke up. Its stick arm was raised, like it was about to knock on the door. Okay, that's it, Mom said, pacing the living room. We're leaving. I don't care how much gas it takes. This is not normal. But when Dad tried to start the car, it wouldn't even turn over. What do you mean it's dead? Mom asked, her voice rising. I don't know. Dad snapped, for once looking as freaked out as the rest of us. It was fine yesterday. Maybe it's the cold, Ben mumbled. But we all knew it wasn't. That night, the faces appeared. They were pale and blurred like frost on the windows, but you could see the outlines. Hollow eyes, sharp teeth, 2 wide grins. They stared at us from every window, unmoving, unblinking. Ben wouldn't stop crying, and honestly, I wanted to join him. Night 6. By the 6th night, I stopped keeping track of the days. It didn't matter anymore. The snowmen kept coming, more of them every morning, surrounding the cabin like some kind of army. The singing was constant now, and it was inside the house. We tried to block it out, stuffing towels under the doors and windows, but it didn't help. The voices wormed their way into our ears, whispering, laughing, taunting.
6 for the frost, 7 for the grave, 8 for the ones who can't be saved.
Dad tried burning one of the snowmen, but it didn't work. By the time the fire died down, the snowman was back, completely unharmed. I stopped sleeping after that. Night 12. By the 12th night, we were barely human. Mom had stopped speaking entirely, just staring out the window at the snowmen with vacant eyes. Dad paced the living room, muttering under his breath. Ben clung to me like a lifeline, and I clung to him right back. The final snowman appeared just before midnight. It was twice as tall as the others, its head brushing the roof of the cabin. Its coal eyes burned like embers, and its mouth was twisted into a jagged smile.
12 for the king, who comes to call. 12 for the end of one and all.
The door burst open, and the cold poured in, sharp and suffocating. I don't remember much after that. Just the sound of Dad screaming, Ben's hand slipping out of mine, and the snow swallowing everything. They found me days later, buried in the wreckage of the cabin. I was the only one left. The doctors said it was hypothermia, that I'd imagined everything, but I know the truth. Every Christmas, I hear the singing. And every Christmas, I wonder if this is the year the snowmen come back for me. I'm not sure why I even came back to Marheim. It's a tiny speck of a town tucked into the mountains of Europe, where everything smells like pine trees and wood smoke, and the winters feel like they go on forever. I left years ago, trading all of it, especially the creepy, old traditions, for a normal life in the city. I'd managed to dodge every invitation to return for Christmas until now, but when my mom called and said, "You owe me, Lucas." I caved. And that's how I ended up standing in the freezing cold, surrounded by villagers in heavy coats, watching the annual Ice Saint parade. If you've never heard of the Ice Saint, you're not alone. It's one of those weird, hyperlocal things no one talks about outside the village. According to legend, the Ice Saint was some kind of protector. Back in the 1700s, when winter was especially brutal, the townsfolk would pray to him for mercy. The story goes that he blessed the harvest and kept the wolves away. But here's the weird part. The Ice Saint wasn't a man or a god. He was a thing, a figure made entirely of ice, with sharp features and hollow eyes. The statue they carry in the parade still gives me the creeps. It's taller than a man, sculpted to look like it's wearing flowing robes, with long fingers clutching a staff. The face is the worst, though. No matter where you stand, those empty, ice-carved eyes seem to follow you. "It's nice, isn't it?" Mom said, tugging her scarf tighter as the statue rolled past on its wooden sled. "Sure, if you're into frozen nightmare fuel," I muttered, shoving my hands deeper into my pockets. She shot me a look, but didn't say anything. She'd always been a believer, like most of the villagers. "The Ice Saint protects us," they'd say. "He keeps the winters mild and the fields fertile." And every year they celebrated with offerings and prayers and that eerie statue. I'd never believed in any of it, though. Not until this year. It started that night. I was staying at my mom's house, the same little place I grew up in. It felt smaller than I remembered, and colder, too, like the walls couldn't keep out the chill anymore. After dinner, Mom went to bed early, and I stayed up scrolling on my phone, trying to pass the time. That's when I heard it. A faint sound, like ice cracking. At first I thought it was the wind, but it was too rhythmic, too deliberate. I grabbed a flashlight and went to the window, half expecting to see some kids messing around in the yard. Instead, I saw the Ice Saint statue. It stood in the middle of the square, just like it always did after the parade, its face tilted slightly toward the church. But something was off. The light from the lamppost caught on its face, and I swear I saw tears, long, frozen streaks running down its cheeks. I blinked, rubbing my eyes, but they didn't go away. The Ice Saint was crying. The next morning, the village was buzzing. "Did you hear about the Martin's cows?" Mom asked over breakfast, her voice low. "What about them?" Frozen solid. "All 6 of them, just standing there in the barn like statues." I frowned. "How does that even happen? Don't they have heaters in the barn?" "They do," she said, stirring her tea absently. "But something must have gone wrong. The Martins weren't the only ones." By the end of the day, half the livestock in the village had turned into icy sculptures, their eyes wide and glassy, frost clinging to their fur. People started whispering about curses and bad omens, but no one said it out loud. No one wanted to admit it, but we all knew something was wrong. I couldn't shake the feeling that this was connected to the Ice Saint. The statue's tears, the frozen animals. It wasn't normal. So I did what any self-respecting skeptic would do. I went to the library. Marheim's library is about as old as the town itself, a dim, musty building with shelves full of books no one's touched in decades. It took me hours of digging through dusty old texts to find anything useful, but eventually I stumbled across a book called Winter Legends of the Mountains. Buried in the back was a chapter on the Ice Saint. Turns out, the story everyone told wasn't the full version. The Ice Saint wasn't always a protector. He was a vengeful spirit, born from a betrayal centuries ago. Back in the 1700s, the village was starving, and the people begged the Ice Saint for help. He agreed, on one condition. They had to make a pact, offering him loyalty and respect in exchange for his protection. For a while it worked. Winters grew milder, and the harvests flourished. But over time, the villagers forgot their promise. They started skipping the offerings, taking the Ice Saint's blessings for granted. And then one year, during the festival, they shattered his statue. That's when the curse began. The Ice Saint turned on them, bringing endless winters and death. The villagers rebuilt the statue, begging for forgiveness, and he stopped. On one condition: every year they had to honor him properly. No shortcuts, no slacking. If they failed, the curse would return. I ran straight to Mom with the book, my heart pounding. "Mom, listen to this." I read her the story, my voice shaking. What if that's what's happening? What if we broke the pact somehow? She frowned. "Lucas, don't be ridiculous. We've done everything right. We always do." "Are you sure?" I pressed. "What if someone messed up? Forgot an offering or something?" She didn't answer. By the 12th night of the festival, the entire village was on edge. No one had slept, and the streets were eerily quiet. The livestock were gone, either frozen or slaughtered for meat, and people were locking their doors before sundown. That evening, I went to the square to check on the statue. It was different now. The frozen tears had multiplied, and cracks webbed across its surface like veins. The air around it felt colder than the rest of the village, sharp and biting. I reached out, almost without thinking, and brushed my fingers against the ice. It was warm. "Lucas." I spun around to see the village priest, Father Anselm, standing behind me. He looked pale and tired, like he hadn't slept in days. "What are you doing here?" I asked. He hesitated, then sighed. "There's something you need to know." It turned out, the festival committee had been cutting corners for years. Cheaper offerings, shorter prayers, skipping the rituals they thought didn't matter. "We thought it was just tradition," Anselm said, his voice trembling. "We didn't realize it was real." Now the Ice Saint was awake, and he wanted revenge. That night, the temperature plummeted. Ice crept up the walls of the houses, and the air filled with a low, mournful sound, like the wind, but deeper. By morning, the statue was gone. So were half the villagers. No one talks about it now, but I'll never forget the sight of those hollow eyes, or the way the air froze in my lungs when the Ice Saint looked at me. The town rebuilt the statue, bigger and grander than before, and the offerings are back to being extravagant. But every Christmas, when the festival begins, I wonder how long it'll be before the Ice Saint decides it isn't enough, because he's not a protector. He never was. It started as one of those Christmas trips you only agree to because everyone else seems so excited. Dan had been planning it for weeks. He'd seen some influencers post about camping in the Arctic wilderness and decided it was our turn to disconnect and rediscover nature. I wasn't sold. In fact, I hated the idea. Snow camping? In December? But there was no saying no to Dan when he got an idea in his head. So, there we were. Me, Shannon, the designated complainer, Dan, the overly enthusiastic planner, Katie, his girlfriend, and way too nice to say no to anything, and Aaron, the quiet guy who always looked like he regretted every decision. We'd driven 8 hours, then hiked 2 more into a frozen nothingness that Dan called the perfect spot. "You'll thank me," Dan had said, grinning as he stomped a cleared patch into the snow for the tents. "It's going to be magical." He wasn't entirely wrong. That first night was beautiful. Stars everywhere, trees draped in snow, the kind of cold that makes everything still and sharp. We built a fire, passed around a flask of whiskey Aaron had smuggled, and told terrible jokes until my cheeks hurt from laughing. But then, just as I was starting to think this wasn't the worst idea in the world, Katie noticed the tracks. "Guys, what's that?" she asked, pointing toward the edge of the clearing. I squinted, stepping closer. Hoof prints. Big ones, cut a perfect circle around our camp. Dan leaned over, frowning. Reindeer, probably. I looked at him. Reindeer? Circling us? Like they're plotting something. Aaron chuckled, but it sounded forced. Maybe they're just curious. Curious about what? I shot back. We don't exactly have carrots lying around. Katie bent down, tracing a finger over the print. It's weird, though. Look how deep these are. Whatever made this was heavy. Okay. That's enough creepy observation, Dan said, trying to lighten the mood. We'll laugh about this tomorrow, I promise. Let's get some sleep. We did. Or tried to. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to a faint sound like something brushing against the tent. I froze, straining to listen. It was soft, deliberate, and too close for comfort. Dan. I whispered, shaking his shoulder. What? Listen. He groaned but sat up, rubbing his face. Then he heard it too. A low, rhythmic crunch of snow, circling the tent. It's probably just the wind, he muttered, lying back down. Wind doesn't have feet. I grabbed my phone, fumbling with the flashlight. The beam cut through the fabric of the tent, casting weird shadows. I was half tempted to unzip it and shine the light outside, but my gut screamed no. Just go back to sleep, Shan, Dan said. But sleep wasn't an option. Not after I noticed the faint glow flickering through the trees. By morning, I'd convinced myself I'd imagined the light. But when we stepped outside, the tracks were back. Fresh, perfect, and even closer to the tents this time. Okay, this is officially weird, Aaron said, breaking his usual silence. Dan tried to laugh it off. It's just an animal, guys. Probably some moose or reindeer wandering around. Aaron raised an eyebrow. Doesn't it bother you that it circled us again? What animal does that? Katie hugged her arms. We should just pack up and go. No way, Dan said. We came all this way. Let's at least enjoy today. Reluctantly, we stayed. The plan was to hike up a nearby ridge and take some photos, but I couldn't shake the unease. Every time I glanced back, I swore I saw shadows flickering through the trees. Just out of reach, just out of focus. By late afternoon, we'd made it back to camp. The fire was barely lit when Katie gasped. Do you see that? We all turned. In the distance between the trees, something glowed. Fireflies. Dan suggested weakly. In the middle of winter. I shot back. The glow moved, shifting like it was alive. And then I saw it, the unmistakable outline of antlers. Massive, twisted, and shining faintly like embers. What the hell is that? Aaron whispered. Dan grabbed a flashlight, aiming it toward the figure. But as soon as the beam hit it, the glow vanished. Okay, we're leaving, I said, already reaching for my pack. But Dan shook his head. Relax. It's just a reindeer or something. Reindeer don't glow. Guys, Katie said, her voice trembling. The tracks are back. We looked down. The hoofprints weren't just near the camp now. They were everywhere, crisscrossing the clearing in chaotic patterns. That night the noises returned. Louder this time. Something heavy moved through the trees, snapping branches like twigs. Stay inside the tents, Aaron said, his voice low. No argument here. I muttered, clutching my sleeping bag like it could actually protect me. The glowing lights returned, dancing just beyond the edge of the clearing. This time they didn't vanish. They moved closer, weaving between the trees in an almost hypnotic pattern. Katie whimpered. It's trying to get us to follow. Aaron nodded. Don't look at it. Don't even think about going out there. And then the whispers started. Faint, almost like wind through the branches, but unmistakably human. They called our names, soft and lilting, promising safety, promising warmth. Dan, of course, didn't listen. "Wait," he said, crawling toward the tent flap. "I think I see someone out there. They might need help." "Dan, no," I hissed, grabbing his arm. But he shook me off. "If it were you, wouldn't you want someone to help?" He unzipped the tent and stepped out before any of us could stop him. "Dan," Katie cried, scrambling after him. Aaron and I followed, the cold hitting like a slap. The lights were closer now, swirling between the trees, almost playful. Dan was walking toward them, his movements stiff and unnatural, like a puppet on strings. "Dan, stop," I yelled. But he didn't. The lights flared suddenly, revealing something I'll never forget. The creature stood taller than any animal I'd ever seen, its body skeletal and covered in patches of frostbitten fur. Its antlers glowed like molten metal, and its eyes were pits of black, endless and hungry. Dan froze, his head tilting unnaturally as if listening to something only he could hear. Katie screamed. Aaron grabbed my arm, yanking me back. "Run," he said. We stumbled through the snow, the whispers growing louder, almost frantic. Behind us, I heard Katie sobbing, begging Dan to follow. But he didn't. We didn't stop running until we reached the car. The sun was just beginning to rise, painting the snow in pale pinks and oranges. I turned, expecting to see Dan behind us, but the woods were silent. Empty. We drove straight to the nearest town and told the authorities what happened. They sent a search party, but they never found him. Katie swears she still hears the whispers sometimes, especially in December. And me? I can't look at Christmas lights without feeling a sick twist in my gut. Because every now and then I see them flicker in a way that reminds me of the Reindeer King. And I swear I hear it calling my name. If there's one thing I've learned in academia, it's this. When a billionaire eccentric calls you out of the blue and offers to fly you to his private estate for a once-in-a-lifetime event, you say yes. You don't think about the weird vibe you get from the invitation, or how his assistant refused to explain what the event was. You just say yes because honestly, who doesn't want free champagne and the chance to rub elbows with people who actually matter? That's how I ended up in an ancient, snow-dusted manor on the edge of nowhere with 6 other so-called intellectuals. The place was unreal. Massive vaulted ceilings, oil paintings that looked like they'd be worth more than my entire career, and a dining table so long you'd need a megaphone to have a conversation. Our host, Emery Delane, made his fortune in, I want to say biotech, or maybe tech. The guy was one of those enigmas you hear about but never actually meet. He looked exactly like you'd expect. Slick back silver hair, a sharp black suit, and the kind of grin that makes you feel like he already knows the punchline to a joke you don't get. We were a motley crew, to say the least. Dr. Harper, an astrophysicist who was one coffee away from vibrating into another dimension, was geeking out over the mansion's antique telescope. Then there was Dr. Ocampo, an archaeologist who looked like she'd stepped straight out of a National Geographic photo shoot. She was carrying a leather-bound journal she didn't let out of her sight. The oddball of the group was definitely Dietrich. He was a historian, or maybe a conspiracy theorist with a raspy voice and a tendency to mutter to himself about hidden truths. I swear the guy smelled faintly of mothballs. And then there was me. I'm Jamie Crane, a nobody anthropologist who somehow got on Emery's radar after publishing a semi-viral article about winter solstice rituals. Compared to everyone else, I was painfully out of my depth. Emery greeted us personally when we arrived, his grin as sharp as the icy wind outside. Welcome, my friends. Tonight will be unforgettable. Looking back, I wish I'd just turned around and left right then and there. Dinner was extravagant, of course. Roasted pheasant, truffle, mashed potatoes, some kind of soup I couldn't pronounce. Emery sat at the head of the table, casually steering the conversation toward esoteric topics. Ancient civilizations, lost artifacts, and the mysteries of the cosmos. It wasn't until dessert, flaming Christmas pudding, naturally, that he dropped the bombshell. I imagine you're all wondering why I brought you here tonight, he said, his voice calm but commanding. I've spent decades and a fortune searching for something extraordinary, something I believe will change the way we understand the universe. He motioned to one of his staff, who wheeled in a small, velvet-lined display case. Inside was a shard of crystal about the size of a dagger, its edges jagged and iridescent. This, Emery continued, is believed to be a fragment of the original Christmas star. The room fell silent. Dr. Harper was the first to break it. That's impossible. The Christmas star was likely a planetary conjunction, or a supernova, not an actual object. Ah, but what if it wasn't? Emery replied, his grin widening. What if it was something far older, far greater than we could ever imagine? Dietrich leaned forward, his eyes practically bulging. You're saying this thing is celestial, not from Earth? Precisely, Emery said. And tonight, on the winter solstice, when the heavens align perfectly, we'll see its true nature. I should have left then. I should have made up an excuse, called for a car, anything. But I didn't, because part of me was curious, and part of me thought it was just an eccentric billionaire showing off a shiny rock. After dinner, Emery led us to the observatory, a circular room with a domed glass ceiling that gave us a panoramic view of the night sky. The crystal shard had been placed on a pedestal in the center of the room, surrounded by an intricate array of mirrors and lenses. This setup, Emery explained, is designed to amplify the shard's resonance with the solstice alignment. Resonance? Ocampo asked skeptically. You'll see soon enough, Emery said, his tone almost playful. The air in the room felt charged, like the moments before a thunderstorm. Emery's staff dimmed the lights, and the only illumination came from the shard itself, which seemed to glow faintly in the darkness. Then, at exactly 11:43 p.m., when the solstice alignment reached its peak, the shard emitted a pulse of light. The light wasn't just bright, it was alive. It filled the room, not like a beam or a glow, but like a presence. It wrapped around us, seeped into us, bypassing our eyes and going straight to our minds. And that's when the vision started. I saw galaxies spinning endlessly, colliding and consuming one another. I saw worlds being born and dying in seconds, their lifespans meaningless against the backdrop of eternity. I saw massive, incomprehensible shapes drifting through the void, beings so vast that stars were like grains of sand to them. And I saw us, humanity, a microscopic speck on the edge of nothing, clinging to a fragile rock in a universe that neither notices nor cares. The worst part wasn't the insignificance. It was the awareness. The entities out there, the ones lurking between the stars. They knew we existed. They just didn't care. We were less than ants to them. Somewhere in the distance, I heard screaming. It might have been me. When the light faded, the room was chaos. Harper was on the floor, clutching her head and muttering equations that didn't make sense. Ocampo had dropped her journal and was staring at her hands like they weren't hers anymore. Dietrich was laughing. A horrible, high-pitched sound that didn't stop. I turned to Emery, who was standing by the pedestal, his expression disturbingly calm. You knew, I whispered. You knew this would happen. Of course, he said, his grin sharper than ever. Isn't it magnificent? Magnificent. I shouted. We're losing our minds. He shrugged. Some truths are too great for fragile human minds. But this is the closest we'll ever come to understanding the universe. I don't remember much about how the night ended. I remember stumbling out of the observatory into the snow, my head spinning, my heart racing. The sky above me was painfully bright, every star a reminder of what I'd seen. The next morning, Emery's staff found me in the woods, half frozen and rambling. I don't know what happened to the others. Emery claimed we'd all had some kind of collective breakdown, but I knew the truth. The shard was gone, and so was the pedestal. Emery said it had been destroyed in the chaos, but I didn't believe him. I left the manor that day and never looked back. It's been 6 months, and I still can't sleep. Every time I close my eyes, I see them. Those vast, uncaring shapes drifting through the void. I feel their awareness brushing against me, cold and indifferent. And sometimes, late at night, I see a faint light outside my window. A pulse, like the heartbeat of a star. I think Emery kept the shard. I think he's still watching. And I think they're watching us too. When my best friend Hannah suggested a trip to Iceland for Christmas, I thought she'd lost her mind. I mean, who goes to Iceland in the middle of winter? But then she showed me the itinerary. Cozy log cabins, natural hot springs, and a guided tour of Icelandic folklore sites. It sounded like one of those Instagram-worthy trips. And honestly, after the year I'd had, I needed it. That's how I ended up crammed into a tiny rental car with Hannah, her boyfriend Chris, and his cousin Ryan. The drive to the lodge took us deep into the countryside, where the mountains loomed like shadowy giants, and snowflakes swirled thick in the headlights. Did you guys hear about the Yule lads? Our guide had asked earlier that day, her voice cheerful as she handed out brochures. They're mischievous Christmas trolls who visit children in the 13 nights before Christmas. Each one has a different personality, like Spoon Licker and Door Slammer, and they leave small gifts in kids' shoes. Trolls. Ryan had laughed, flipping through the brochure, like Shrek. The guide had smiled patiently. Not quite. They're a big part of Icelandic folklore. Harmless fun, really. The lodge was straight out of a Hallmark movie. Timber walls, a roaring fireplace, and a massive Christmas tree in the corner. It was run by an older woman named Marta, who greeted us with mulled wine and a platter of homemade cookies. It's a special time of year, Marta said, her accent thick but warm. The Yule lads are already out and about. I glanced at Hannah, who was practically vibrating with excitement. She loved Christmas. Me, not so much. But even I had to admit the place had a certain charm. That first night we sat by the fire, playing card games and swapping stories. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, but inside everything felt cozy and safe. I should have known it wouldn't last. The next morning I was the first to wake up. The fire had gone out, and the lodge was eerily quiet. I pulled on my coat and stepped outside to get some fresh air. The snow was untouched, a perfect blanket of white stretching out in every direction. Except for the hoofprints. They were massive, easily twice the size of any animal I could think of, and they circled the lodge in a strange, looping pattern. My breath fogged in the icy air as I followed the trail, my boots crunching softly in the snow. "What are you doing?" Hannah's voice startled me. She was standing in the doorway, wrapped in a blanket, and looking half asleep. "There are hoofprints," I said, pointing to the tracks. "Like really big ones." Hannah squinted at the snow. "Probably just reindeer. This is Iceland, after all." "Yeah, probably," I muttered, though something about the tracks felt wrong. By the time we sat down for breakfast, I'd almost convinced myself it was nothing. Almost. But then Chris pulled a small wooden figure from his boot. "What the hell is this?" he asked, holding it up. It was a crude carving of a figure with long, spindly arms and a grotesquely grinning face. "Maybe Marta left it," Ryan said, chuckling. "You know, like a little Christmas prank." Chris frowned. "She went through my stuff. Relax," Hannah said, rolling her eyes. "It's probably part of the Yule lads' tradition or something. Isn't this the kind of thing we came here for?" Chris didn't look convinced, but he dropped the figure on the table and went back to his eggs. That night I couldn't sleep. The wind had picked up again, howling against the windows and making the whole lodge creak. I was just starting to drift off when I heard it. A sharp, deliberate knock. I froze, my heart hammering. It wasn't coming from the door. It was coming from the window. For a long moment, I didn't move. Then, slowly, I sat up and peeked through the curtains. Nothing, just the swirling snow. I told myself it was the wind. It had to be. But when I lay back down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there. The next day, Marta seemed tense. The smile she'd worn so easily before was gone, replaced by a tight-lipped expression that made me uneasy. "Did you hear anything last night?" I asked her. She hesitated, her hands gripping the edge of the counter. "The Yule lads," she said finally. "They are. Mischievous, yes, but not always kind." "What do you mean?" She glanced around, as if afraid someone might overhear. "The stories say they are pranksters. But the old stories, the real stories, tell of something darker. The Yule lads are not trolls. They are predators. They demand a sacrifice." I laughed nervously, waiting for her to say she was joking. She didn't. That night, the lodge felt different. The warmth that had made it so inviting was gone, replaced by an oppressive, suffocating stillness. We locked the doors and windows, but it didn't help. Around midnight, the knocking started again. This time it wasn't just one window. The sound came from all around us, relentless and echoing. "What the hell is that?" Chris shouted, his face pale. "I don't know," I said, clutching the fireplace poker like it would do any good. The knocking stopped. And then we heard the laughter. It was high-pitched and echoing, like the wind itself was mocking us. "They're outside," Marta whispered. "No," Ryan said, his voice trembling. "They're inside." The Yule lads weren't what I expected. They weren't jolly trolls or mischievous pranksters. They were wrong. Twisted forms with two long limbs and faces that didn't quite fit together. Their glowing eyes burned like embers in the darkness. The first one came through the chimney, its gangly body unfolding like a spider. Another emerged from the shadows near the Christmas tree, its grin stretching impossibly wide. We ran. The lodge became a maze, the walls seeming to shift and close in around us. No matter which door we opened, we always ended up back in the main room, where the Yule lads waited, their laughter growing louder and more frenzied. "They want a sacrifice," Marta said, her voice barely audible. "We have to give them someone." It was Chris who made the choice. "Stay back," he shouted, swinging a chair at one of the lads. "Run. Get out of here." We didn't argue. Hannah grabbed my arm and we bolted for the door. The last thing I saw before we made it outside was Chris being dragged toward the fireplace, his screams echoing in the freezing night. We found a rescue team the next morning. They didn't believe us, of course. They said Chris must have gotten lost in the snow. But I know the truth. The Yule lads aren't part of some harmless tradition. They're ancient, hungry things that demand blood to mark the season. And every Christmas I hear that same laughter echoing in the wind. And there you have it. 5 stories to remind you that even in the season of joy, darkness is never far away. These tales aren't just stories. They're warnings. Warnings to tread carefully with old traditions, to question the things that go bump in the night, and to always pay attention to the shadows lurking just out of sight. If you enjoyed unraveling these sinister tales, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit that notification bell. That way, you'll never miss another journey into the unknown. And before you go, tell me, which story chilled you the most? Or better yet, share your own holiday horror in the comments below. Who knows? Your story might just end up here next time. Until then, I'm Bon, wishing you a very unsettling holiday season. Stay safe out there.